This is Computing Up, conversations about computation writ large with Michael Littman and Dave Ackley. This episode was recorded March 27th, 2024. Computing Up regrets the delay in its publication.
Dave, you ever think about collective cognition?
I don't know.
Do you know what it is?
Well, I mean, I could make up a meaning of it, but I don't know
Maybe
what
we
it
can think about it
officially
together.
is. That would be an example, perhaps. I mean, I
Maybe.
certainly think individuality is overrated. Exactly how to come at that, I don't know.
Well, so you were talking to me about this a little ways back, and I thought, you know, it'd be really fun is if we could talk to somebody who actually has looked into this.
Oh.
And I was decided to reach out to the person that I reach out to probably too often. He's my go-to guy, and I feel a little lazy because he's just so much fun and interesting to me that that I may go to that well a little bit too much. But so I invited Steve Sloman from the what I think it used to be called CLPS. It might have changed names, but the Cognitive Linguistic and Psychological Sciences Department at Brown University. Steve, what's the department actually called now?
It's still called CLPS, but not for long. It's changed. Linguistics has moved out. And so we're now, well, there's a debate about what we are. The initials are CPS, but the developmental psychologists hate that because that's, of course, stands for Child Protective Services, which is just a little too appropriate for the rest of us. And so I don't know, we're calling ourselves like COSI or something like that.
COSI, all right.
CPS officially would unpack into computation, psychology. What's CPS?
No, cognitive and psychological sciences.
Cognitive and psychological. Okay, I got it. Yeah, cool.
So when I graduated from college in 1988, I had one magic word. I'm like, okay, I studied computer science. That was great. But what I really want to do is cognitive science, because cognitive is the coolest word. Whenever my girlfriend, now wife, said something that was sort of interesting from a what's going on in your head perspective, I would say, oh, that was very cognitive. And so I just dreamed that someday I would go for graduate school at this department at Brown that was called cognitive science, because they had cognitive right there in the name.
Cognitive right there.
But ultimately, I ended up joining the research group at Belcour, which, Dave, what was it called?
Cognitive Science Research Group.
That's right. That's right.
Yes.
And so I got to, and what I learned in the Cognitive Science Research Group, working with Dave Ackley and several other amazing people, was that I'm not actually a cognitive scientist. I'm a computer scientist who just loves to hang around with cognitive scientists. So when I got to Brown, I kind of forced myself on Steve a bit, and it was just fantastic. It was just great to kind of hear the stuff that he works on. So Steve, could you say a little bit about what your background is and what you like to study?
Sure. Although I gotta say, all these comments about going to the well too much, I don't know what you're talking about.
No,
you
really,
should be hanging around in our department much more than you are. You know what the beauty of being a cognitive scientist is?
I do
that
not.
Nobody knows what the hell you do. So you can define yourself any which way you want, right?
That's fair. That's fair. Yeah. Well, just to enumerate some of the going to the well things, I feel like one of the main ones was when I was asked to write a report on the state of AI. I was like, oh, of course I should have Steve on this committee, and so I had you on the AI 100 committee, and you wrote a section on AI, artificial and natural intelligence, for that, which was terrific. Then when I was trying to figure out how to write a book, I was like, oh, let me read Steve's book, and then I can go to him and say, hey, tell me how this whole book writing thing works. And then you ended up being really pivotal in how I ultimately picked a publisher.
Oh, wow. Well, that's great. I know that I was not pivotal in the content of the book, because I remember walking my dog and being inspired about, your area, reinforcement learning. And I wrote down an entire outline of a book for you, which I sent you. And your response was something like, Nah, I'm not interested in writing that book.
That's
So
fair.
the point
But
is, you were not being the well enough. You were
No,
offering
that's
more
right.
well, and Michael didn't
And I
take
didn't
exactly.
drink at that well. But the
Yeah,
problem was that
exactly.
Dave and I actually had sketched out a very similar book to the one that you sketched, Steve, and it didn't end up
didn't
gelling.
come
We didn't end
together.
up writing it, and so it was
Well,
complicated. It became very
well,
complicated, and
I
so that
see.
was my
I
response.
see. I see. And your book is doing very well, I assume. I'm
I
sure it's a
mean, it's
great.
sitting on my shelf and it's pretty. Like that's kind of cool.
Well, it exists. I mean,
Yeah,
that's the base wellness, I think.
yeah.
Because I got tons of books that don't exist.
I
Well,
wish I
Steve,
did.
but
Okay,
Steve, the
so
book.
right, you want an answer to the
Yeah.
question.
All right.
Who
Give
am I?
background.
Who am I? So I went to grad school in the late 80s at the time that connectionism
Me
hit
too.
the fan.
I just had a very
And
nice conversation with Jay McClelland, by the way. Speaking of
oh,
cognitive
No
wow.
science and
doubt.
connectionism,
And the
he is
90s, the 80s.
he's so cool. He's still very energetic and enthusiastic. Like a lot of us are very depressed these days, and he was just still going at it. So I was super
Yeah.
impressed.
Well, that's
He's a
good.
very positive guy. But you know who else was really cool and was on my committee? Dave Rummelhart.
He was on my committee
Oh,
too.
oh,
No. Are you
oh!
Yes,
serious?
absolutely. Yeah.
How's
And
that possible? Were you at Stanford?
I was at CMU in 1987, and Jeff Hinton, who was my advisor, was good friends with Rummelhart from UCSD,
I see.
so Rummelhart was my outside committee
I
member.
see. Wow.
And he was
Okay.
great, and I remember him sitting with me and saying, this is very clear. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
so happy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the thing about Dave Rummelhart is he never said anything negative about anyone or about any idea, right? He was always positive. And it worked for him because he always managed to associate with someone with a stick, some gruff old guy
Ah,
who sort of served as
Take
the
the
bad
bad
cop.
cop.
good cop,
Yeah.
Yeah,
bad cop. Right.
exactly. So at UCSD, it was Don Norman.
Still
That's
is
what
in
I
some
hear.
ways.
Okay. And then at Stanford, it was Gordon Bauer.
Wow.
Oh,
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny because I don't know if I understood that about Dave Rumelhart at the time, but since then I've become sort of a relentlessly positive sort of person. At least, if I think of something negative, then I tend to stop myself and say there ought to be a positive way to say that. So it doesn't come naturally, but it seems like it's much more effective. So I don't know. I guess
wait.
I
And so
need
was
a.
Gordon Bauer George Furness's advisor?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know George Furness. So
Okay.
Gordon Bauer was, the cognitive psychologist's cognitive psychologist. So I don't know. Was George Furness a cognitive psychologist?
He was
He was?
indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, all right. So we're still trying to figure out how you came to be in the world here. So
All
you
right.
you were at
So
Stanford doing cognitive psychology. Is that what I have?
yes, yes.
Yes.
And then I eventually got a job at Brown, and I was the high-level cognition person in my department, studying categorization and reasoning and things like that. And around the year 2000, I read Judea Pearl's book Causality,
Hmm.
which was about causal Bayes nets for those for whom that means something. And it really turned me around because in my field, everybody had been talking about causality constantly, but I felt like nobody knew what they were talking about, or at least I had no idea what they were talking about. And so suddenly, after reading Pearl's book, I felt like, oh, this might be a meaningful concept. And so I pursued that for a number of years, for about 15 years or so, before I realized that people don't have nearly as much causal knowledge as they think they do.
Uh-huh.
Ooh.
A lot
That's
of our,
yeah.
yeah, a lot of our studies, they just displayed shocking amounts of ignorance.
That's the problem
I
with working with people. They will always let you down.
Let's be positive now, Michael.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
So
there we
David,
go.
help me fix that, David.
Yeah.
People have lots of answers.
People try really hard.
Well, but I have a question. I still think about causality, and I ask myself, is it real, or is it completely a mental construct that we put onto the world? And I can argue it either way in my head. Where do you come down? What's the answer?
Well, I can argue it either way too. And there is a sense in which I think the universe is just a bunch of fluctuating energy, right?
Right.
On the other
Resistance to
hand,
free will, like really quickly. Is that where we are?
I don't think we're quite
well,
there yet.
not. Yeah,
Okay.
give me another sentence, Michael.
All right, go for it.
I'll get there. But on the other hand, if we're going to talk about agents, right? If we're going to talk about organism or any sort of entity that can make a difference in the world, then we require the concept of causality to do it. So I don't know, I'm no philosopher, right? And I don't know metaphysically if there's causality, but I do know that you need the concept in order to survive.
So even if it's a mental construct, it's necessary for our mental operations to be effective. So at the very least, something causality like exists inside physical brains, in your brain and my brain and everybody's brain, like that. Exactly. So it's real to that degree, even if it's not necessarily real to say the baseball broke the window, the baseball caused the window. When you say the baseball caused the window to break, you're making a statement about how we interpret things. You're making a statement about ideas rather than saying because there's causality in the physical universe. Does that make any sense? I don't know.
Well, so if the baseball actually did cause the window to break, then I would say yes, that's a true statement. That the and you have to make those sorts of statements if you're going to attribute responsibility and blame.
Right. But then it's a statement about the statement, or the truth of it is the truth of the statement. The ball broke the window, or the ball caused the window to break, rather than anything actually about, I don't know, it's about some sort of correspondence between a statement and a physical dynamics or something. It does get nasty. It does get nasty.
Yeah.
Maybe we should push on.
Yeah. All right. Look, I think it's true that the truth of the statement depends on this counterfactual, right? It depends on something.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was
never
thinking.
occurred. Yeah.
Right.
So there is a sense that in which it's sort of a matter of will or interpretation.
Right.
But nevertheless, it's real in like every pragmatic sense that you could possibly consider.
But in the sense that just about anything that we can talk about is real.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, I can buy that. And
all right, but you didn't
so
just stay in causality, because you
Right.
discovered this sort of quirk, which is that people, even when they think they're being reasoning about causal influences, they're actually just kind of winging it.
Well, so what I discovered is that people's causal knowledge is really minimal. More importantly, more minimal than they think it is. Right. So there's this thing in cognitive science called the illusion of explanatory depth, which is that if you ask people how well they understand how something works, simple things like ballpoint pens and zippers and toilets, and then people tend to think they understand them pretty well. But then you ask them to explain how they work, and suddenly their illusion of understanding is punctured, and they realize they don't understand so well.
So wait a minute. So I'm having one of these connecto moments. There was a book that had a bunch of stuff about this, and it had a bunch of experiments, like people, asked people if they understood a crossbow or a toilet or a helicopter, and then you explained a little bit about how the crossbow worked, and then all of a sudden they decided, is that what we're talking about there? Or is that
I
related?
wrote that book.
That was what I thought the connection was. I know you. I know your stuff.
All right.
That stuff was great. And it worked absolutely for me. I never touched a crossbow and thought, oh yeah, I totally could imagine how that ought to work. But I've had a lot of experience with toilets, and it's like they are freaking magic.
Ballpoint pens. I am very freaked out by ballpoint pens. I've studied. I spent like an hour just like watching the thing rotate. I'm like, I don't understand why it's rotating. Like, I could not explain very much of the ballpoint. But I think I knew that.
Wait, am I responsible for that hour that you devoted?
Because I think like when I should have been listening to lectures and things in school, I would take apart the pen and I'd be like, how would I make this? Why is it made this way? Why are the notches there? So I think I knew going into it that was a mystery to me. And toilets too. I spent a lot of time unclogging toilets from the inside. And but it's still really remarkable to me, this sort of idea that you can get this dumbfounding effect where people they're absolutely convinced that they know the answer until you ask them to give the answer. And then they're like, wait, that was there a minute ago. Where did it go?
Yeah.
So can I say three things actually? One, I didn't write the book alone. I have to point out I had a co-author, Phil Fernbach.
Collective cognition.
Right? It was collective cognition, absolutely. The other thing I want to point out is that the original demonstration of what we call the knowledge illusion, right? That's the title of the book, was not ours. Our contribution to the science was to show that it's also true in the political domain, that people's attitudes about policies or their understanding and attitudes about policies are also susceptible to the same effect of trying to explain.
And is the underlying thing that most people are actually very far from making policy, therefore they know about as much about making policy as I do about crossbows?
It's an interesting question whether policymakers themselves suffer from the knowledge illusion, right?
About policy.
About policy, that's right.
Yeah.
Look, the basic idea is that everything that, is worth anything is incredibly complicated. I mean, if ballpoint pens are so much more complicated than they seem, then think about how complicated Obamacare is, right? It's just, it's all over. It's a 20,000 page document. I mean, and so there are multiple policymakers who are involved, like probably thousands, right? Who are involved in creating something like that.
Right.
So part of what makes the illusion of explanatory depth or the knowledge illusion so weird is that it's not all knowledge, right? There's some knowledge that people are actually pretty aware of the fact that they don't know something, but it's these almost causal kinds of stories where you're like, well, I know how to make that happen, or I've been told that that's what would happen, and so I'm willing to accept that, and therefore I know the mechanism.
Right.
Isn't that right?
Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. There are a number of factors that influence the strength of the effect. One is how visible the mechanism is. So one of my favorite examples is ask people to draw a bicycle. You can, and this is where you can even ask, regular cyclists to draw a bicycle, and you'd be shocked what comes out. It's just amazing, right?
As long as we have a control that proves they can draw anything.
No, because these are really,
enough.
I think they're intended to be very simple drawings of what's connected to what, where are the pieces,
right.
And then you look at it, even an expert
schematic.
cyclist, it's like that could not physically work, right? The thing you just drew, it's not only is it wrong, but it's impossible.
Like the pedals aren't connected to the chain, or the chain goes to the front wheel or something, so you couldn't turn the thing. And that's standard, right?
Wow.
And how people draw these things. Yeah. And I think that one is so powerful because we have this illusion we understand the mechanism because we can see the mechanism.
Yeah.
Right? Like I can imagine my bicycle and it's like, well, of course I know how it works. I can sort of run it in my head.
Right. Yeah, I think that this can only prove that everybody but me is stupid. because I feel like I could totally draw a picture of a bicycle. I mean,
Yeah.
it's possible I'm wrong. It's
Are we going
possible.
to test them? Are we going to test them, Michael?
Yeah,
I would.
and,
Jake, do you want to draw? I'll talk to Steve for a second while you draw. All right, so Dave's
all
getting
right,
impatient. See
I
how
will
this
draw.
goes. Okay. So Steve, a question for you is, what does this do to people when it's pointed out? Because I could imagine, I've certainly been in discussions with people when people are wrong and it's pointed out that they're wrong, and it just makes them angry. I pointed out sometimes people are wrong, or maybe people pointed out that I'm wrong, and like depression or this sort of feeling of inadequacy. How do people respond when their bubbles pop?
Yeah. Well, people respond in different ways. I think the most normal way is just to sort of turn their backs and find someone else to talk to, right? So
I see.
that
So you do
works.
these experiments on the train sometimes, it sounds like.
Yeah, if I want to be alone, that's right. No, I mean, think about like going to a party, right? And approaching someone and asking them to describe, to explain how something works. It's like the last thing people want to do, right? So by the way, just as an aside, my new book is about what people do like to do, which is different from generating these sorts of mechanical explanations of things.
What people do like to do. What you just like for fun, or in certain circumstances? What do you mean?
In certain circumstances. So it's about how when we're thinking about social and political policy, thinking about social political decisions, moral decisions, that rather than thinking about the consequences, right? So thinking causally is about thinking about how causes produce effects, how consequences come about. And usually when we're talking about sort of high level social things, people don't want to talk about consequences. What they want to talk about are their sacred values, or sometimes called their protected values. They want to talk about what actions are good and what actions are bad.
I see. What matters to them.
Yeah. Well, and what matters is action as opposed to outcome, right? Because outcome is too hard to think about, whereas action is simple.
And intention. People say my intention was good. And therefore the fact that it ruined everything was not my fault, or whatever.
Right, cut me some slack. Do you have your picture, Dave?
I do, but I really wish I was listening to that conversation a little closer. So I screwed it up. So you can ding me for that. But can anybody see that?
You have to put it in the podcast thing. But okay, I see a front wheel, and I see a steering wheel connected to the front wheel. I see a seat and a base. There's the chains connected to the right thing. That is actually Dave. I had no idea.
That's very good.
That's pretty
Not
impressive.
too bad, except for that the front derailleur is grinding into the ground.
It is a little low.
So I didn't have. If it had been a pencil, I could have pushed that up, but I didn't. So okay, so therefore everybody else is stupid, just as I expected.
Yeah, I guess that's what we've proven.
No. Therefore, you are brilliant, right?
But that's such an excuse that lets everybody else off the hook. I hate it.
Are you a bicycle mechanic?
No. I mean, but I don't know. I feel like I've certainly had enough bicycles, and I certainly had the chain fall off the derailleur enough, and and I even got the front post that the front wheel is connected to tipped, so it'll actually camber in correctly and tend to roll straight. Like that. On. So that was a little bit of I don't know.
That's very impressive. Okay, so we've
all right.
Yeah,
but so while I was proving this, so it sounded like you guys had shifted from causality to morality, or something like that. Is that at all what was being discussed? The people prefer to make judgmental statements about good and bad rather than causal statements about this causes that.
So I'm my new book is about when people are thinking about policy or thinking about other social problems, because it's hard for them to think about causality, to think about how interactions will produce consequences. Instead, we simplify and tend to just have these simple slogans that are about what actions are right and what actions are wrong. And so I actually think a big reason for the knowledge illusion in the political domain is because that's how people normally think about policy. So when you ask them to explain, what you're doing is you're completely reframing the issue for them. So now
Right.
you're forcing them to think about it mechanically instead of in their preferred way, which is in terms of their basic values.
Right. Love your neighbor or something doesn't have anything to
Perfect.
do with how you do it or how you judge
Exactly.
which neighbor and so on and so forth. I mean, when I come at this sort of idea from a computing point of view, I think that, morality is like a fitness function for a search process. So one way to build a machine is to have like if-then rules, have a first do this, and then when you detect that's completed, you move on. You have a sequential program. Another way to write a program is to make a search process and delegate the state of coming up with different things, and then all you have to do is say no, 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 no. Yeah, good.
Right. So you write the objective function instead of
you
the
write the
actual
fitness
steps.
function, right, and then you delegate the actual steps to a search process. And it almost, if I try to be nice to people for a minute, sounds like if they're trying to make these judgmental statements, maybe they're just trying to state a fitness function and delegate the sequencing.
Yeah, maybe. But remember that fitness functions can be defined over outcomes or over actions.
Yes,
right?
yes, right, or entire plans, whatever we want. Yeah. Right. Well, that's very interesting. And so I was looking at some of just quickly looking at some of your more recent papers instead of just the book that I read long ago and didn't know it. And one of the reasons that I was agreeing with Michael that we needed to talk to you was because of this whole political stuff, this whole how it informs the polarization that we're currently facing, and so on and so forth. And it certainly seems that at least part of the story is it's the simple story, the simplicity of these arguments, that it's all the fault of blah, and therefore give me your power and I'll fix blah. Like that.
You didn't tell me he was so articulate, Michael.
I mean, blah is a technical term.
There's lots of different kinds of blah. And so what I wonder is that the important part of the problem, or is it something else? Is it something about how we are with respect to hierarchy or authority, how we're willing to give over so much power under some circumstances but not others, so much so that it doesn't really matter whether our computation stuff is all that right or not? Does that make any sense?
Yeah. So the theme of the knowledge illusion is actually what Michael first brought up, right? Collective cognition. That is our idea. The question we pose is, given that people seem to be so ignorant about how even simple things work, never mind complex things, how is it that humanity has achieved so much, right? And the answer we offer, and we're not the first to offer it, is that we work with other people, and that any serious success is of the product of a community, not just of an individual.
Right. And so that's the "we never think alone"
slogan
from the paper. Yeah, and that sounds, and that reminds me of Ed Hutchins with distributed cognition and cognition in the wild, that sort of thing. And that which leads back to me saying, maybe the fault is thinking that we're individuals rather than thinking that we are part of this distributed computation that's going on, where the code that we choose to run is essentially entirely dependent on what everybody else is running and what we get from them. And we have these tiny little bits that are unique to us because of where we're located in space or because of our history or something like that. But almost everything else is this common code base that we are marinating in, and yet don't seem to talk about.
Right. Yeah, we don't see it, right? Like we're stuck in our
perspective. What is water? One of those things, like that.
Well, so one of the things from Yeah,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
guys, finish that, David.
You mean what is water if you're a fish? Was that?
If you're a fish,
yeah, exactly.
Okay,
Yeah,
got
yeah.
it. Got it. Got it.
So one of the things in the book that I feel like relates to this that I feel like it really messed with my head, like in a good way. Like it makes me see the world a little bit differently. Is some of these experiments you reported on where you analyze the behavior of a group, how successful a group is in terms of the individual sort of talents of the people in the group versus whether or not there's somebody in the group who's just good at being in a group, helping people facilitate their behaviors in a group. And I was wondering if there's any updates on that, or if you could just kind of tell us a little bit about how do we think about that?
So that's not my work. A lot of that was done by this woman, Anita Woolley. And what she shows is that you get groups to do a variety of tasks, and then you try to predict their performance on a new task. And it turns out that the IQ of the members of the group is non-predictive, right? That it's irrelevant. You look at the maximum intelligence or the average intelligence, it's just not a good way to predict the group's performance. Rather, measures of how well the people get along, like whether they take turns in conversation, right? There's some evidence that certain measures of empathy are pretty good. The last thing I read by Anita Woolley, she was arguing that the number of women in the group is the best predictor.
Because being a woman is associated with those other qualities,
exactly,
turn taking and so on and so forth.
Exactly,
that's great.
Exactly.
I mean, yeah, and I feel like I don't know, Western intelligence, maybe everybody. I'm not sure exactly who to say is in the wrong here, but that. There is obviously needs to be protocols, structures for distributed computation to work. There needs to be turn taking and ways to turn the channel around and ways to signal without destroying the channels and all of that stuff that we don't talk about nearly enough, and in fact we kind of denigrate in favor of abstract knowledge or individual abstract truth, and we say these soft skills like the ability to listen, or something like that is bad or is less, somehow like that. And it seems to me that in a future we ought to be able to understand the interaction of people as a first-class distributed computational problem for which certain protocols and certain architectures are overall better, utterly independent of the knowledge, utterly independent of the expertise of the elements like that. And we need to promote that. We need to make it more, more important, more central something.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting empirical question. Like, I guess, there's this underlying tendency to believe that executive horsepower is hard to come by, right? So if you find someone with great executive horsepower, you got to latch on to them and
pay them millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah. Whereas, it's not so obvious to me that what's hard to come by are people who have serious empathy.
Right.
Who are really good at understanding others, putting what they're saying in context, relating them to other people. Like we often think of that, psychologists are very guilty of this. We kind of think of that as what's basically human, right? Like we have people like to throw this term theory of mind. We have this great power to understand other people. Well, the truth is not very many people do. Right.
Even if they can, they don't necessarily spend much time doing it.
Well, maybe. Yeah, that's a possibility.
Like that. Well, I mean, if you're thinking about myself all the time, I don't have time to think about.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
But yeah, and don't I in fact solve the other mind problems by thinking they're like me, except small list of distinguishing characteristics, something like that. Not as smart,
right.
Whatever. Whatever it is.
They don't draw bicycles as well. That's
exactly.
Yeah.
They're completely messed up about bicycles.
For sure.
And
so, sorry, go ahead.
No.
So I just want to make this distinction that I think is really important. So when you talk about a community of knowledge, right? Like philosophers talk about the division of cognitive labor, right? And how, whenever we produce things, it's because of this division. We have specialized roles, blah, blah, blah. So we tend to think about it the way we're talking about it in terms of how we collaborate with other people. But there's another element too, which is that we outsource some of our problems. Like we don't collaborate, we have someone else do it. If I have a programming problem, I'll give it to Michael, right? I'm not going to do it myself because I'm not capable of it. And statistics, I mean, there's all sorts of problems. Like when I need my toilet fixed, I call the plumber. And the plumber doesn't, I don't collaborate with the plumber. My collaboration is to make a phone call and give the person some money, right? That's about it.
Well,
so outsourcing is this really important property of cognition.
So can you draw a line there about where collaboration ends, or what key element is to be collaboration rather than just services for hire?
Well, that's an interesting question. I haven't. So it seems to me collaboration involves interaction, like some sort of common representation in real time of the problem you're trying to solve, right? Whereas you can outsource to dead people, right? Like you can outsource.
That doesn't sound like it would be very successful.
Well, you can outsource to Isaac Newton, right? Like you can say, like they leave traces, they leave their theories, they leave their writings, and we make use of those things. Are we really collaborating with them? I mean, we're not influencing them, right? But they're influencing us.
Okay, all right. So one distinction is sort of pointing, referring for purposes of communication. I'm talking about the stuff Newton was talking about. I'm talking about the apple on the head. And then people say, oh, okay, I know what you're talking about. But the apple on the head, and Newton in particular, is not altered by my utterance of invoking his thing. Whereas if you and I are collaborating and we might not even know what we're collaborating about, like this discussion, and we're figuring it out mutually in real time. So the point is the closed loopness of it, the fact that I'm impacted by your communications, you're impacted by my communications, and we end up in thinking, oh, that's a good idea, that is neither of our starting points. So that would be the center, or a really good collaboration thing.
Great. I like that. You put that really well.
And I mean, I
told
think
you
a
he was
lot.
articulate.
Well, I think a lot about, again, in this distributed computation thing, what are the basic principles? What are the basic metrics that we ought to have? And one of them absolutely is latency. How long does it take to close the influence to get a signal, not just to get a signal one way, but to get a round trip signal? That's what the latency is. And without without having a round trip signal, this collaboration thing that you're talking about, we can't do it like that. It's necessarily going to be a pointer of some kind at best. And so, one of the good and the bad about, say, the internet is that it potentially makes these low latency connections between people that never could have had such things before, and they can wind each other up, they can make each other more brilliant, they can make each other more angry, everything. And I mean, I feel like, we're just playing with fire. I mean, and fire is very powerful. It's a good thing and a bad thing. But I'm scared of the conflagration as well. And I want to know, so a lot of the things you're adding is this sort of political context. And so how can we harness the fire? How can we avoid burning the whole damn place down? What do you say? Yeah, sure. How could be a hard problem? Is there any
I'll tell you not to vote
outsourcing
for.
that to you.
Yeah, I'm outsourcing. Right, I see. He's outsourcing it to me. Right. Well, but I mean, I'm an American, at least one of my cells is American. And so, my first reaction is I can tell you who not to vote for if you don't want a conflagration, right?
Right.
But look, this is the problem of the day. And, I don't feel that I am someone who has anything particularly deep or important to say about it. I mean, the mishmash of free speech issues and emergencies and the problem of literal explosions, right, that could arise by virtue of this incredibly powerful intelligence is something that we just have to tread really lightly. I don't know. I don't know what else to say.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, that sounds okay to me. I mean, I go back and forth from what we really need is good spirit. And what we really need is to promote good spirit, and that can be used in a kind of vacuous, nasty way of la la, everything is perfect and stuff like that. But without that, I mean, there's so much bad spirit out there. There's so much bad faith out there, and I feel like we just sort of let it go by. We let it slide by. We try to ignore it, and we have to stop doing that. We have to say, well, if you could think of a less jerky way to say it, maybe we could talk about it. But the fact that one's being a jerk is the topic right now, like that, and not let people go past that until people either acknowledge it or say, well, I have to be a jerk because X, Y, Z, and then okay, then we move on from there.
So look, there have been two revelations to me. I mean, one is the degree to which we live in echo chambers, right? Like in 2016, I was just knocked over by how little I understood about this country, right? And I'm constantly bowled over by the degree to which people don't understand me, right? In fact, even people who surround me, right? They don't understand me, but look, I don't understand them. I mean, it's mutual. The other thing is the degree to which people are really not propelled by truth, right? So what's surprising, I mean, it doesn't cease to surprise me how we just don't care about truth. What motivates us is other things. A lot of it is community affiliation, right? So that's the main reason people share fake news. It's not because they think it's true. They might know that it's BS. But they just, they want to titillate their friends or they want to present themselves as pushing a particular perspective or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I had this particular thought that, if we have this collection of machines out in the world that are running collections of code of all sorts of different stuff, depending on their affiliations, as you say, and we want to know how is the population of our people doing? How many of our type of people are there? It's like, what could we ask them to say that we would then know that it's out there? And the problem is, if they say something that's true, then it's ambiguous. It might be they're saying something that's true because it's true. And the best way to know if there's our people out there is to pick a specific error, pick a specific lie, and say, if you say this lie, that means you're one of us. So all of these different groups have their chosen error, which is the sort of thing that they over-exaggerate, the thing that they take too far, specifically to show affiliation with a particular group. And if it was true, it wouldn't do that. That was the thought that, and it's helped me a little bit as far as all the lies that are out there, like that. And I do think it's. Go ahead.
Do you think it's possible to, in this day of AI, is it possible to force AI, the new intelligence, to care about truth? I mean, imagine if we could. Imagine if the rule was you're only allowed to spout it back if you have solid evidence for it,
Right.
right?
If we could figure out what solid evidence means.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
You think that's the big
Shifty sands.
roadblock? Yeah.
Well, I
Well,
I don't think we know how to build AI like that, but if we could, it is unclear exactly what would constitute that kind of justification, right?
I mean, yeah, I think there's border cases even letting AI aside, just between people, and the truth. When you're talking about the behavior of a physics of a hydrogen atom or something like that, you can be very crisp and mathematical about what's true and what isn't. But for lots of other stuff, it seems that truth kind of is a group construct rather than an abstract Platonic ideal. Or am I just being cynical?
No, I mean, the narrative is the thing, right? And we all tell our stories. And as even PBS NewsHour has a narrative, right?
Absolutely.
That's very clear. Absolutely.
Just a really boring one.
Well,
I'm teasing. I'm sorry.
It's a sweet one, actually. It's a Sesame Street one, written into news or something.
Well, I don't know. I don't know. I'm not quite as optimistic about it as you. But the point I want to make is, so there are narratives, but then there are facts. Now, right, like certain things we can agree are facts, like the number of cars you own, right? Like that's could be determined, or whether it's raining outside, or how many people showed up for a demonstration or an inauguration. I mean, these are facts that could be measured.
I mean, but they're facts, but they can always be pushed. I have a car that I think I own, but I have lost the paperwork. I have a car, but it's fallen down into a pile of rust, and I'm not even sure it's a car anymore. And you can always find these edge cases. So truth is only really solid in the meat of the conceptual space. Right. And especially people who are trying to be jerks, especially people who don't like what we like, they're going to immediately go to those little special cases and say, oh, look, I identify as a car, so I have 3, or whatever it is, and I don't know what to do about that, except, well, that's not in good spirit, so let's talk about that.
Set it aside.
Well, Steve, this has been a ton of fun, and
depressing and enlightening.
Well, the depressing part isn't news, so that's okay.
Factor that in,
and have to believe that being able to describe things clearly, as Dave Rumelhart told me to do, can only help in the end. And so we keep trying to do that. And so do you end up on par thinking that we've got any hope here, or Steve, or are we pretty much screwed?
No. We clearly have hope. Look, I don't think things are so different than they were 25 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 200 years ago, right? I mean, we're just seeing the same old movie play out again and again and again.
Right. Although maybe,
things will be different. But
keep turning up the volume by putting these communication methods in place. I mean, so one person I was reading about was talking about the arrival of the Gutenberg press had a similar disruptive effect of making misinformation spread much more widely, and a lot of our classic terrible untruths originated in the period after the press and so on. So the internet is just like more of that. Well, okay, all right. So,
but just remember how many untruths there were before the Gutenberg press.
That's
right. Like even more, maybe.
Yeah. Truth was an accident before science.
Exactly.
Something like that. Steve, well, again, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. I thought it was a great help.
This has been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed it a lot. Thanks so much for the invitation.
This was Computing Up. Thanks for listening.